Hello and welcome to the Creative Critique. My name is Robert Rodriguez Jr. And today we're going to work on these two images by Paul. Thanks, Paul, for submitting these images. As usual, I'm going to talk about compositional elements of the images, what works, what perhaps doesn't work so well, how we can improve them. And then I'll use Lightroom to make adjustments that I think make the images look as best as possible. Obviously, we're looking for something that is visually satisfying, but also I want to cover how we can do that and why to make certain adjustments in Lightroom given all the tools that are available now. I will be using Lightroom Classic CC version 7, which has lots of new features and lots of new tools that I will explore in depth as I see fit in each image. So let's get started. So this first image here by Paul is quite nice. I don't see anything with cropping. That's usually the first thing that I like to address right away because I think that has the biggest impact, obviously, on the composition and what we're going to adjust. And if something is going to be cropped out of the image, then it's better to get rid of it as soon as possible. Sometimes we're not so sure, and so we can wait a little while and see. But in this case, for the most part, I think I don't see any need for cropping right away. Nice clean edges. There's nothing that feels like it doesn't belong, that doesn't distract. The horizon line is up almost around a third, so that's pretty nice. We see here the main elements of the composition. So for me, this really strong diagonal starting in from the corner, which is very nice. Lots of interesting texture all along here, pulls the eye up. There's a nice shadow line here which kind of creates this sweeping S-curve, and then we see more repetition of that S-curve around here and so forth. So there's a nice rhythm and repetition there, which I think works quite well. Also, even though the sky is a little washed out at this point, we haven't clipped anything. You can see that in the histogram right there. So you see there's nothing clipping in the histogram. In the highlights, if there were clipping, we would see something right along the right edge like a spike there, but there is nothing there. So it means that we have lots of information that we can recover, and this is a nice example also of exposing to the right. Notice how all of the tones starting here and ending here are as far to the right as possible. So we're maximizing the most sensitive part of the sensor here, and we're avoiding the noisiest part of the sensor there. So this is a great example, again, of exposing to the right, which is, again, probably why the image looks a little brighter than I think it should look. This looks like the sun is setting somewhat. You can see that from the harsh angle of the light here and the shadows it creates along those edges. The sun is coming in this way, or the light, I should say, from the sun, okay, is coming in that direction. And so you can see how it creates those highlights and shadows. And so we're going to want to darken this image a little bit exposure-wise to I think get it to look the way to look its best and to bring out all the richness of the color. A few key areas that I think we need to be careful about are, one, making sure that we can get this sky active. By that I mean darken it enough so that these clouds that you see up here work together with the composition as they can, because you can see ideas of that here, repeating elements, and then of course we got these sweeping lines there. So we'd like to have this image work from top to bottom, starting way down here and work its way all the way up there and create dynamic energy throughout the entire image. So I think that is a positive, something that's really strong about the composition that we want to make sure that we emphasize. And so that's, again, looking at the things that are working quite well. I think the one key area for me that I would be I'm a little concerned about, one, is this edge here on the left hand side, which is very bright, and we don't want the eye getting pulled in this direction, which is going to happen if we just leave it the way it is. You can see here how there's a strong tendency for your eye to kind of want to look in that direction, and so that's something that we want to address at some point. The other thing compositionally that I think might be something that can be improved in the future is maybe a slightly lower perspective would have created more depth from front to back. So in other words, all these ridges here and all of this texture here, if we could have gotten the camera a little bit lower, would have created, I think, a lot more depth in the image. But that's just something that perhaps could have helped, or maybe Paul could have tried an additional capture where you lower the camera a bit and get a little more depth front to back, because as we bring the camera closer to the ground, we bring those elements closer, and based on the lens that's used, that makes them more dramatic. And so bringing the camera lower to the ground would have really given us more depth, I think. But that's not something that I think is detrimental to the image that much. Okay, so those are the basic elements. I think, once again, it's a strong composition. It's just a question of emphasizing the three elements. In particular, one of the areas I look at the image as well is there are some, we definitely want to try to emphasize the patterns here in the water, because I think that creates a nice bridge between our very obvious foreground and the very obvious sky. We definitely want to make sure that the water that doesn't just become kind of a uniform band, but in fact we're able to take advantage of the the variation that you see there in the water. So again, something that we can address in Lightroom. Okay, so let's jump into Lightroom. And we are, let's jump into the develop module. And I'm going to proceed as I normally do, starting globally and working down to the local level. So again, getting the image to look as best as possible, get it in the ballpark of what we're looking for. And that's basically done through the basic panel here. So first, I mentioned at the beginning about exposure. So let's drop our exposure a little bit. Okay, and see if we can't get a little more depth and richness in the color. So I'm going to stop there, and you see just by dropping it down about a half stop, we make the foreground look a little bit richer, not as bright, and we get a little more variation in the sky. Next, I'm going to go to the whites, check my white point, and in this case, we do want to set a white point, because you can see from looking at the image that probably the brightest part of the sky should be a solid white. So we have a solid white. I mentioned that because not every image is going to have something that's solid white or solid black. And in this case, I think we want to have a solid black, because that'll give us maximum contrast in the shadows here and in these dark areas. So holding down the Option key, adjusting the blacks, and I'm going to stop around there and back off a bit. Well, I'll stop there for now. And again, these are not set and forget. I always come back and readjust them. Okay, so now that I've done that, I'm going to go back and readjust my exposure, make it a bit brighter. Okay, I'm down a quarter of a stop. Now, typically I like to get the image looking as best as possible using global adjustments, everything in the basic panel here. By the way, one thing I forgot, I'm sorry. Let's jump down to lens correction and turn that on. This is something that should be done at the beginning when you import images. You could do it automatically in import, or you can do it as soon as you start working on an image. But you should definitely turn on lens enable profile correction here, and I forgot. By turning that on, it just fixes the light fall off in the edges. You can see the corners of the image get a little brighter. It fixes distortion if it has any. In this case, we don't have any. But again, that makes the whole image look a little more even in terms of the light captured by the lens. Okay, let's go back to the basic panel. So as I said, I usually like to get everything as close as possible with using the basic panel. But in this case, I'm going to jump right to a graduated filter, because I want to bring this sky more into the tonal range of the rest of the image, and obviously it's too bright now. So let's click on the graduated filter here. I'm going to drag down around here and create a fairly gradual transition. Again, the further apart I drag these lines, the more gradual the transition. The closer they are to each other, the more abrupt or the harder the edge of that transition. So I want a somewhat of a gradual transition. Place it around here. And then I'm going to pull down a little bit with exposure, a little bit with the highlights. I'm also going to push up on clarity or add clarity. That'll give us mid-tone contrast for those clouds. Maybe pull down exposure a little bit more. One of the things we can also do with any of the adjustments is set an independent white and black point, which is really nice. So maybe push up the white point a bit and pull down the black point a bit, just on the sky area. Now, if I pull this filter down, you notice that as I said, it creates a more gradual transition, but notice how it now starts to affect other parts of the image. And I actually like what that's doing to the water there. You see, it gives us a little more depth and separation in the water there. So I'm actually going to pull this down and let that filter kind of spill over into the water a bit. Maybe I'll move this up a bit like that. Okay, so we'll stop there. Now, in combination with the graduated filter, when I'm using it to darken skies and when I have blue skies, sometimes what I'll do is I'll drop here down to HSL and use the luminance slider in the blue channel to pull down on the blues like so. And that's the equivalent basically of a virtual polarizer, because that's what a polarizer does. In this case, though, we don't have to commit to the polarization in the field. We can do it afterwards. So by pulling down this blue channel here, the luminosity in the blue channel, you see we're actually able to add even more separation between the sky and the clouds. Okay, and that's really nice there. So I'm going to stop there. So let's see where we are so far. Backslash key above the return key shows us before and after. All right, nice big difference there. Let's make a few more adjustments in the basic panel. Going to boost clarity. Clarity gives us nice mid-tone contrast, especially useful in these areas here. I'm going to push up the vibrance, get a little more color now and richness into the image. Maybe a vibrance around there and a little bit of saturation. Okay, I'm always checking before and after to see how far I've gone. Okay, now I'm going to, I want to add a little bit of overall contrast now to give the image a little more punch. That's going to make that light a little stronger, a little more dramatic. I can add it in the contrast slider here, but I'm going to jump down to the tone curve and add it here instead because I have a little more control on the tone curve. So I'm going to, I could add some points here and create a basic S-curve, but Lightroom provides some easy presets. So I'm going to jump down here and use the medium contrast. Okay, and you can see already that gives us a lot of richness here in the foreground, which is really nice. And again, looking at it before and after, okay, we can see a huge difference there. Let's jump down to detail and just take care of sharpening. I'm going to zoom in at 100%. Make sure you're at 100% or 1:1 to see the effect of the sharpening. I'm going to add some sharpening here till it looks fairly good on my screen. I see everything looking nice and crisp. I'm going to use a medium radius, not too low, not too high. We have a lot of detail, but not an excessive amount. It isn't like we're really close and looking at individual sand grains. So I think a radius of 1 or 1.1 is good. That prevents us from sharpening more than we need to sharpen. And then I'm going to back out to 100% again and use the masking adjustment to mask off areas of the image that don't need sharpening, primarily the sky and some of the water in the background. So holding down the Option key and pushing up on the masking control, you see right away Lightroom will block off or mask off the sky, which is really nice. And the reason why this is so critical is because it creates an uneven sharpening, but sharpening in areas that need it most. It applies it there, like here, and doesn't apply the sharpening back here, which means we're creating more depth and more interest, more variation in the image. And because our eyes are attracted to areas that are sharper versus areas that are not, again, it pushes the sky more towards the back, giving us more space in the image, more depth. I'm going to add a little bit of noise reduction here. Zoom in again. Image looks pretty clean, but just add a little bit of noise reduction here. 15 in luminance and about 15 in color. One little thing here that I will mention is as I'm zooming in here, there's what appears to be a white speck here of something, whether that's garbage or a shell or whatever. But this is something that might be considered an artifact, especially if you print it large. It's something that looks out of place, doesn't look like it necessarily belongs. There's not a pattern of them. And in general, you don't want anything that's going to distract the eye. And so I would easily go in here with the spotting tool. I'm going to hit Q, make my spotting tool bigger than the object I want to spot, click on it once, and if it does a good job, you won't have to move it. But in this case, I think it could be better. So this is what we're cloning or spotting. This is where we're spotting from. So you can actually move this around freely to find something that's a little more natural. And usually it actually gives you a, like it's doing here now, it gives you a live preview so you can see what that looks like. I'm just sort of lining this up. Okay, we zoom back out again, and now you see that's gone. It's not something that's going to catch the eye. We can really take in the whole image without noticing anything that looks kind of out of place. Okay, I'm going to come back to the basic panel, and now that I'm looking at the image, we're much closer to something that we're starting to feel like the image is looking more finished. I want to adjust my white balance a bit. I'm going a little bit warmer, and again, this is going to be subjective, so I can't make the final decision for Paul, but I can at least offer a suggestion. If we go too warm, well, I've come up quite a bit here. I don't want to lose the blues in the sky, but I find here the image gets a little warmer, a little richer. The sand here, the sunlight, we know that it's late light. You can see that because of the yellow and orange of the light here. So I think that kind of emphasizes the mood of the image a bit more. So again, here's where we were. Cooler and flat, of course. Here, much richer and warmer. Okay, here I'm going to jump to some local adjustments to do a few things. One is I'm going to select the brush tool here, and I'm just going to select the preset, which is darken. And if you look carefully in the sand here, well, let me back up before I say that. So for me, dodging and burning can be very useful in an image because it helps to emphasize compositional elements in the image that are working well, typically leading lines and ways to move the viewer through the image. You want to create a path for the viewer. You want to make it easy for the viewer to move through the image and show them exactly what the image is about. And we can do that through areas of light and dark and through contrast, because those things create edges, and our eyes are, again, attracted to areas of high contrast. So for example, you get attracted to this edge and this edge first before what's in here, because those edges have the highest amount of contrast. So I want to try to emphasize that. If you look over here, there's a darker patch here, and if I just add a little adjustment mask here, you can see that we can make that a little darker, maybe a little bit over here as well. And even over here. And again, I'm working on this idea of making that left side a little bit darker. Now that's a little bit much for me, so I'm going to come back over here and adjust the amount and make it not so abrupt. So let's say that's a 0.2 of a stop, negative stop. Similarly, I'm going to use that same adjustment brush to darken this ridge in here, or this shadow in here. Again, that helps to really emphasize that line there and that beautiful S-curve that flows up here. Here's another one there repeating. There's another one over here as well. Okay, and here's another one that we can add there like that. Okay, and that's what my adjustment mask looks like so far. I'm also maybe going to add it to a few spots here just to really emphasize the lines leading into this corner. And maybe a little bit over here like that. And then I think that so far, also maybe this little edge there as well. Next, I'm going to add a new adjustment brush and select the preset, call it lighten. And then I'm going to lighten a few areas. For example, this edge here. Okay, that's a beautiful edge there because you see that it kind of really helps to lead the eye through there. Now, that's a little bit too obvious for me, so I'm going to undo twice. Okay, so I undid everything I did, and I'm just going to drop the flow. The flow is right here, and this allows us to apply this adjustment not at 100% opacity, which is what 100 in the flow means, but if I set it to 50, it means that our opacity for this adjustment brush now is at 50%. So now I can do this, I can add that in, and I'm only applying it at 50%. And if I want to add a little bit more here, see, I can build it up in stages, and that's basically what I'm doing when I drop the flow. Or when you use the flow control at 50, 60, 70, you're able to apply the adjustment in stages. I'm going to raise the flow back up to 100% again. Maybe brighten this area here. I don't like that. Undo. Maybe just along the edge here, like so. Maybe down here as well, just to give us a little more variation there. I talked about the water here before and how we might be able to make this water a little more interesting, give it more variation. So I'm going to create a new brush, and same thing, I'm just going to add a mask here. And if I hover over the pin, you can see my mask. Now notice that the mask is spilling over into the sky. And one of the newest features in Lightroom Classic is the ability to limit the mask to a color. The way you do that is you come down here, right in the controls here, and there's a range mask setting here. It's set to off right now. I'm going to click that to color. And then I can click on the dropper and click and drag to create an area of color that I want to affect with this mask. And I'm going to drag it out to about there like that, because I want all those different shades of green. Okay. Now, when we go back and hover over our pin, you can see that it has eliminated the water, and it's only picking up the colors of the, it's eliminated the sky, and it's only going to be adjusting the colors that I highlighted, which is the colors of the ocean there. That's a very powerful feature. It allows us to create masks or adjustments based on color range versus an edge. And I think this is really a powerful feature that Lightroom has added. So now we can go in here and raise the exposure a bit. And look what happens when we raise that exposure. Okay, we open up the water, we add some more variation in the water. We can see some interesting patterns there in the water. That really connects the foreground and the sky through this water area. And look at it the way it looked before. We had some variation there, but when I added contrast and when I added more blacks, we kind of lost that. And so I'm trying to recover that now. All right, so open up the shadows a bit more, a little more exposure there. All right, I think that works pretty well. One last adjustment I'm going to make here. I'm going to add one more graduated filter. I'm going to pull in along the left here to address the issue that I mentioned before about the left side of the image being a little bit too bright for my taste. And if we pull along the left and then we darken this a little bit, I can just add a slight gradation to that left hand side, I think, which helps to keep the eye flowing into the center of the image. Oh, not too much. I want to make that natural. And if I like what it's doing up here, which I do, but I don't want it to darken this area here, well, that's easy to adjust as well. So what I can do here is I can modify this graduated filter, another powerful feature in Lightroom. I can, with this filter selected, I can switch to a brush. And then if the brush is set to a normal brush, meaning it has the plus sign, it means I'm going to add to this filter, but I want to erase from this filter. I want to take away or adjust the mask by taking away from the mask. And so I'm going to hold on the Option key to turn that brush into an erase brush, and now I can erase these areas down here from that mask, which means that they won't affect, or this graduated filter won't affect this area of the image. And if I come back and hover over the pin, you can see here how it's changed. Right now you don't see it as much as you should, or I didn't erase as much as I wanted to, and the reason for that is because when I hold down the Option key again to make this an erase brush, you notice that my flow is set at 50, and I really wanted the erase brush to erase at 100% or at a flow of 100. So let me raise the flow up to 100. And now I can really, you can see the difference now. Okay, so basically I'm removing that filter from this area of the image, which is dark enough already, but I want to keep it over here. And now that's what the filter looks like. And I can clean it up a bit more there, maybe here, even go into this edge here to let that light be nice and bright there. Okay, so I'm going to go back to this graduated filter that I added for the sky. I think I'm just going to add a little more clarity, pull down a bit more. Okay, and then I'm finally going to go back and recheck my white point and black points again. So here's the white point, hold on Option. I can come up quite a bit now. And black point, a little bit darker. Right there. Okay. And I think that gives us a really nice looking image. You can see all the elements that I mentioned or talked about before. These deep blacks here. In fact, we can go a little bit lower in the blacks, I think. There we go. So you really get some nice strong lines coming in through the foreground. Your eye really gets pulled up into these repeating waves and curves here. We darken this side so your eye doesn't get pulled that way. You can see that I have lights and shadows here, which keep your eye moving in. We get to this water section that I think is more interesting now, and then beautiful sort of pastel-y sky, not big bold clouds, but just wispy clouds in the sky that I think add a nice light touch to the foreground. And I think it's important to keep a sense of balance. Notice how a lot of the drama and the energy of the image is here, not so much up here. And I think that's how it should be. We want to create this variety so that our eye moves between areas that are different. If I would have gone for a much more aggressive sky, thinking, for example, about how to make the sky look powerful and how to make those waves really, how to make those clouds really stand out, sure, you can make the sky look unbelievable. But the question is, how does that affect the entire image? How does the whole image work as a whole? And so you have to always keep that in mind. You have to keep in mind that the composition has to work within the entire rectangle. And if everything is equally loud or vibrant, then you have no nuance and no subtlety. And I think that in this case, we want to have that subtlety. There's a beautiful subtlety between the foreground and the sky, and that I think makes the image that much more beautiful. All right, so that's those are my recommendations and my adjustments for this image. Hope that was helpful. Thanks. So on to the second image. First thing that attracted me to this image, or that I liked about it, was nice color. There's a certain drama to the sky. A lot of the shapes, the way they flow through the sky here, are really nice. I like that there are some interesting repeating shapes here. These kind of lines moving through the image are really nice. You've got another triangle here and over here as well. So lots of kind of graphic elements here, which I think play off each other quite well, from the rock here to the ocean and then up into the sky. And the lighthouse creates a really nice accent point there, I think. It sort of breaks that flow and gives us something to focus on, which I think leads to the other thing that I also noticed about this image, is that there's no denying that the lighthouse is the center of interest. It is the focal point of the image. And because of that, I think it's probably placed a little too close to this edge here. It feels a little bit out of balance, if you will. I think the fact that the composition is broken right down the middle makes it feel a little symmetrical. Doesn't feel as though the sky or the land has a little more, neither one has more weight than the other. And because of that, I think it kind of places a lot of emphasis once again on the lighthouse. And it's almost as though the lighthouse isn't commanding as much attention in the image as it should. It really should be, I think, an image about the lighthouse in its setting. But yet the lighthouse is sort of trying to compete with all these other elements. And so while this is the center of interest simply because it's distinct and different, it's man-made, it's got different color, all of those things, it's really trying to compete with everything over here. It's almost like two images. If you kind of deleted if you remove the lighthouse from there, if you imagine this image without the lighthouse, the image kind of stands on its own with all the shapes and the textures. Of course, you wouldn't have that center of interest. And so because the lighthouse is unique, I think it needs to have a little more presence. And right now, we're not getting that. So how do we get that? Well, I think given the image that we have to do some sort of cropping. And so that's something that I would do right at the beginning. Now, I might consider cropping to bring the lighthouse closer to a third, like so, but that doesn't quite work, because what happens is that we really lose a lot of the other parts of the image. We lose those repeating lines and shapes that I mentioned before. So that's not going to quite work. The other thing is, if you look at the image, really the lines are moving left and right, as I highlighted before. It's not really an image about up and down, but left and right. So another suggestion or another approach might be to crop it more as a panorama, because really the sky becomes monotonous from here up, all of the activities from here down. So we could bring our crop down around there somewhere. And then down here, you don't want to lose as much. You've got this nice diagonal coming in, but I think we have to crop a little bit more. Okay, we can even come down lower here to really catch where the sky is really becoming active. So we look at that now. I think that starts to become a little stronger compositionally, because now your eye is moving more left and right. You're flowing more left and right, and you're able to bounce between, again, the sky and the ocean and that lighthouse as well. I hesitate to come in from the left only because I think we lose a lot of the shapes of the clouds, and we lose the movement of the eye. So if anything, I would even come a little bit closer down from the bottom. Now this is all subjective. I think compositionally there is some truth to the fact that the composition is stronger, but as far as how far we want to go, that's something that Paul will have to decide on his own. But I do think that eliminating what is extra and really trying to focus in on what we have here, I think, is the way to go. And so I think a panorama here, or cropping out the bottom and the top to get the movement stronger left and right, I think makes for a stronger composition. Okay, so let's move to our basic adjustments. Let's set our white point right around the lighthouse there, and we do have an absolute white, so it's that spot there. Let's set our black point. When you set your white point and your black point, you definitely want to let go of the option key and look at the image and see exactly what is going white or black. In other words, what is going solid black, and are we losing any detail there? And so as I pull the black point down, you can see that it's some of these shadows here, and those are very dark. So I don't mind going a little past clipping there, because it just gives us more depth and more contrast in the image, but we're not losing any detail there that we need to preserve. So there's our before and there's our after. I'm going to add, I'm going to pull down on the highlights a bit to give our sky a little more depth slightly. And I'm going to push up on the shadows to open up some of the shadows over here. And I might even push up in the exposure now a bit. Well, maybe not. We'll stop there. We'll leave it where it was, and we'll continue along and see how it goes. Again, a lot of this developing should be an iterative process. You make adjustments, you come back and you see where you are, you continue to make adjustments, and you continue to revisit past adjustments, exposure, white point and black point. You keep moving those tones and massaging those tones around until you get everything in the image to work. So here's our before and there's our after. I'm going to add some clarity. I'm going to add definitely some vibrance, a little bit of saturation as well. Okay, once again, I'm going to push up on the exposure. Why am I doing that? I'm a little concerned that the water is going a little dark, and you see just by pushing the exposure up again by 0.15, 0.2, we start to open up some of this beautiful gradation in the ocean. I think that's very important. So I'm going to go up to 0.20 and leave it there. I'm also going to do the same thing I did in the last image, which is to drop a graduated filter right at the beginning for our sky, because it's so important to the image that I want to try to get that working more with the rest of the image to get us more in the ballpark of what the image should look like. So I'm going to drop the graduated filter there, get it straight with our horizon, pull down a bit on exposure, add some clarity. That gives us mid-tone contrast in the sky there. Maybe push up on the white point in the sky just to make that sky really come alive and sing. Okay, and I think that does a nice job there. And we'll close that. Again, before and after. Oh, once again, I forgot to turn on lens correction. Let's turn that on. Okay, so again, it just brightens up our corners there. Just as a quick tip, I have my lens correction enabled in an import preset. So whenever I import images into Lightroom, I apply an import preset that simply has that lens correction checkbox turned on, and this way I don't forget to turn it on when I'm editing images. So that's just a shortcut to be able to do that. Okay, I'm going to come back now to temperature and maybe warm up the image a bit. Okay, I'm looking at the temperature. I'm looking at the quality of the light and whether I think it's better warmer or cooler. And again, this is definitely going to be subjective according to the photographer. But from my standpoint, when I do that, I see some warmer light hitting the surf here. These white caps here look a little warmer now. The lighthouse has a little more of a golden tint to it, and I think that makes the image a little warmer. I think that's the quality that the image needs to have. So warmed it up a little bit there. Let's jump down to detail. Zoom in. Increase sharpening. I'm going to take the amount up to about 50, about 55 or so there. I'm going to keep my radius fairly low. We do have a lot of texture and detail here. These grasses here. The rock here, so 1.0 works well. I'm going to push the detail slider up. The detail slider improves the sharpening along small radiuses, and so when you have a small radius like we're using now, or a low radius, then using the detail slider helps to pull out even more detail. So I'm going to bring that up around 50, and then masking. Hold on the Option key, push up on the masking control, and once again Lightroom masks off the sky beautifully, which is exactly what we want. Less sharpening on the sky, smooth areas that don't need the sharpening, a little more sharpening on the water, and maximum sharpening in this area here. And that helps to bring that landform forward and push the sky backwards or back in the image, giving us more depth, more a three-dimensional feel. I'm gonna add a little noise reduction here. Once again, I'll zoom in. This image looks pretty clean, but I'm going to add some just for safety. Anything between 10 and 15 is pretty safe. You're not going to see anything and have any detrimental effects in terms of blurring your image. And I'm going to pull back down on the color here. I'm going to push up the sharpening just a bit. This area here looks a little soft to me. Lighthouse is pretty good, but in general, the image looks a little bit on the soft side. I'm not sure whether that is the focusing or the lens itself, or the aperture, the focus point, but just adding a little more sharpening there. Okay, so that's, to me, looking a lot better. Let's go before and after. So as I mentioned before, compositionally, I want to try to emphasize, I think we should emphasize this leading edge here along the rocks and the edge of the ocean, and then we swing back up here to the lighthouse. We've got another edge here, and then we've got clouds that move you up into the sky. So lots of rhythm there, which is really nice. So how can we emphasize that? How can we improve that? Well, one, I think we can add a little more variation to these grasses here. So I'm going to go to an adjustment brush, and I'll click on lighten as a preset. I'm going to make my brush fairly small and just maybe touch a few areas here to give us some color variation there, some tonal variation. Maybe that edge there. And by using the same brush, I'm just going to hit a few spots here. The light is hitting here, so we want to try to emphasize some of that. Maybe even here in the end, okay? And also going to maybe touch up some of these white areas here along the edge of the water to give us more of a sense of the energy, the sound of the surf hitting those rocks, and maybe in some of these rocks down here. So again, that really just gives us a lot more movement tonally in that area. I'm going to drop the flow to 50, and I'm just going to add a subtle effect here to these areas. All right, so that's what that mask looks like so far. I'm going to raise the flow up again to 100 and maybe add a little touch there like that. Okay. Now we'll create a new brush, make this darken. And I'm looking, when I do this, I'm looking at the areas that I brightened, not simply because I brightened those areas, but because those are the areas that I feel are emphasizing the light, the natural light that exists in the image already. So I'm looking at those areas and looking at the shadow sides of those areas. If there are areas that are darker, that are in shadow, again, emphasizing the light that's in the image and the lack of light. So first area that I want to apply that to is right here. And you see how that creates a little more depth here because the light is stronger here than it is over here. And same thing in these shadow areas here. This texture in this rock is very nice. So we're just bringing that a little bit more. This is all getting light, but down here, behind these rocks, we've got shadows, and this just gives us more depth and dimension to these areas. Right in here is a dark area. We brighten this water here, but this is a dark area here where there is no surface. So that just gives us, again, more dimension. Same thing here. You can darken that edge there because we brightened this area here. So there's your shadow. Perhaps in here, maybe in here, and some areas here. I may even darken the side of the lighthouse there, and also right in there. So again, creating more variation. I'm also going to create a new brush, and I'm going to drop the flow. And I want this one to be very, very subtle. And I might just touch the bottom of these clouds here, and it's very subtle, so I can add some more again. And maybe even here like so, just to give us a little more depth. Okay, one more thing I'm going to add now is another graduated filter, and I'm going to come up along this edge. And this is experimental, which means I'm trying this. I don't know that this is going to quite work, but again, I'm just looking to create more variation, more interest across the whole image. Notice that we've got from the middle of the image all the way to the edge here, it's mostly ocean. So I'm trying to give that more energy, more drama. As photographers, we're observing things in nature. We're seeing them, we're feeling them, we're hearing them, we're smelling them. Things are happening there. The ocean isn't static, it's moving, it's got energy to it, and all of that is impacting what we see and how we feel. And then we make a photograph and it looks kind of static. And we're trying to create more visual interest there, which hopefully translates to something that the viewer can imagine. And that's what you want. You want to invite imagination into your image. So I'm going to brighten that a little bit. Maybe add some clarity. Maybe not clarity. Maybe a little more contrast in that area. And open up some of those shadows. So that's our before and that's our after. I'm going to revisit the lighthouse again. I'm going to zoom in here and I'm going to create a new brush and just make this a darken brush and try to create a little more tonal variation. So maybe darken this back edge of the lighthouse. And that's a lot, too much, but I just want you to see what I'm doing there. So around here perhaps. And so when we look at the before, lighthouse is fairly flat, but you can see it has texture. It has stone and weathering effect, and we want to preserve that as much as possible. And I'll even also going to go back to that adjustment brush, that mask there, and pull down on the highlights as well. There we go. That's a little more of the effect I was looking for. Let's go back and check our white point. right at the lighthouse there. We'll pull down on the highlight some more. We'll check our black point. It's good. I'm just going to add a little overall contrast to the image. And I'm going to come up in exposure a bit more. Maybe come down a little bit on the saturation. Why? I don't want the color to, I think, take over the image. There's a lot of color here, there's a lot of richness, but we don't want the color to take over. We want to really preserve the movement of the eye through the image. And once again, the subtlety, sort of the softness of the sky and the clouds over this beautiful outcropping of rock with a lighthouse on it. And I think that's what makes the image more inviting. It invites imagination. It invites the viewer to step into the scene versus kind of shouting at them and telling them exactly what to look at. You let them explore. You let them identify what's interesting to them. But again, the definitely with a sense of what's important in the image, which is this lighthouse set on this overlook with this beautiful sky in the background and this calm, smooth ocean with receding waves into the distance, I think. And that's really, really nice. If we, one more thing that, now that I mentioned that, if we add a mask, and this is also experimental, not sure if this is going to work, but I'm just going to add this mask here along the ocean. And I'm just going to add a tiny, tiny bit of clarity to that. You see how that brings out more of those lines that are receding into the distance towards the horizon. So finally, there's our before, there's our after, and I think that is how I would go about adjusting this image to get the most out of it, not only for viewing on screen, but for making a print. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. Thanks again, Paul, for submitting these images. Take care. Hello, and welcome back to the print portion of the Creative Critique. This is where I take the two images that I worked on and make fine art prints of them, and I'll discuss the printing, obviously the paper or papers that I selected and why, and then I'll show you the prints and maybe discuss how they came out and how I feel about them. Of course, this is a somewhat subjective approach because I'm making decisions for the photographer in question, but hopefully I'm presenting it in a way that isn't so much about the specific case itself, but concepts and ideas that you can apply and adapt for your images. So that's the idea. Not that these are final decisions, but how I arrived at these decisions. And if you see differently or you feel that you can arrive at a different result on your own, then you know why. And so that's really what I'm trying to get across here. So we're working with Paul's images. Let's jump to this first one that we worked on. And for this image, when it came to choosing paper, like all images, I think about the paper characteristics and how those characteristics can complement what's in the image. And so this image to me is one where the deep blacks here, the shadows in these textures and the blacks in these textures, the contrast is really important because the contrast creates that beautiful texture in the foreground. And there's also very interesting darks here that I think we want to preserve. I would not consider this a painterly image. It's very quite dramatic. There's a lot of strong light, and I think that a paper that has higher density, more contrast, is the one that's really going to make this image work in terms of how I developed it and what main compositional elements of the image are. So it's not painterly. It's not an image that is soft in terms of what it's saying. Yes, it's a very smooth image in terms of the scene, but I wouldn't call it soft. It's got quite a dramatic feel to it. And so for that, I decided to try Canson Infinity Platine Fiber Rag. Platine Fiber Rag is a high contrast paper. It has sort of a satin finish, but it's a very fine paper. By fine, I mean that when you hold it, it's got a cotton backing. I call this paper the the luster paper or the fiber paper that wants to be a matte paper. It sort of wants to be a painterly paper, but provides that extra contrast and demax. But it's got a very slight surface texture on it that I think is really nice as well. So, okay, so that's the image printed on platine fiber rag, and I think it really preserves the color, it preserves the texture, it preserves the blacks. The contrast is what I was looking for, and that's the thing that you're going to get from a higher contrast paper like platine. A lot more contrast than a matte paper, and I think this image needs it. If I zoom in here, you can see the very subtle surface texture up here. It's got a really nice sort of random texture that adds a lot of depth to the image, but it doesn't detract. So even though I'm zoomed in at 2:1 here, when I back out again, you can see that it really doesn't interfere with the sky. The sky has clouds and so forth in it already, so it's not like we're looking for super smooth areas. And once again, it does a great job with the sand here. It adds that extra dimension to the sand that I think really works. So I think that this it looks pretty good on platine fiber rag. I was really happy with the results there. Moving to the second image, this image is quite different. We're not looking at high areas of contrast like we did in the first image. In other words, the highest areas of contrast are along between the rock and the ocean here. And, that's just a general edge. It's not an edge that we need high contrast to emphasize. And really, that's not what we want to emphasize. What we want to emphasize here is the light and the color and the mood. And I would call this much more painterly than the first image. It's more about the feel of standing in this particular place and looking at the lighthouse and the light falling on it and the sound of the ocean rolling in and out. A lot of it is more painterly. Even the clouds they're not rich in terms of being loud and colorful. The clouds are very soft. They look like they're gray. They're not catching any real strong light. They're really more just shapes moving through the top portion of the image. And so for that reason, my first inclination, my first instinct was to go on a matte paper, because the matte paper is going to remove that high contrast that makes the image look and feel louder, more aggressive, and it's going to subdue it. It's going to make it quieter. It's going to make it more lyrical, more painterly. And I think that's exactly what this image is about. It's more about the scene and about how it feels, the wind, the sound of the ocean, etc. Now, one thing I do when I print on a matte paper is that I will add a little bit of extra clarity to the print version of the image, just to give us a little more punch, because we're going on to a matte paper, which is, somewhat softer in terms of its texture. All right, and when we look at the print, and once again, I was really happy with the feel. That's the thing that I was looking for most. A matte paper, reduced contrast. It doesn't reduce texture. We don't lose anything in terms of the detail of the texture. You can see that all of the texture is preserved in the rocks. We've got beautiful texture in the ocean here. The detail of the lighthouse here is preserved. But you can see, and by texture I mean the texture of the elements themselves. In other words, the textures in the rocks, the details of this fence here. Edition etching rag by Canson Infinity really holds texture really well. In fact, all of Canson's papers, matte papers, hold and preserve texture and detail really well. But you can see the texture in the paper itself. Perhaps if I move over this way, you can see it's got a nice texture, a nice sort of dimension to the paper that I think adds, once again, depth and richness to the print. And this is a poor approximation of actually holding it in your hand and seeing it, but hopefully you get a sense of what that looks like. When you hold it in your hand, you can really experience the texture of the paper, but does not interfere, I think, with the image itself. And that's because edition etching, the texture is very fine. It isn't very strong or deep. But reduced contrast makes the print look more painterly, less photographic, and I think that that's the thing that complements this image best. To me, that's what the image feels like. If you're looking for something more aggressive, then you you can change papers and choose a paper that gives you more a sense of being louder. I use the word volume, or the idea of volume, a lot when choosing papers. And this image to me is not so much about volume; it's more about exploring and feeling and getting a sense of what the scene entailed, and the emotion that the photographer is trying to convey to the viewer. All right, so those are the two prints. I'm pretty happy with the way they came out, and those are the papers that I think work best, and why.